Thank you, Ronnie. And thank you, Mardi Gras and Kathleen and Ward and Eric and Des, who've been my hosts and chauffeurs, and not in that order. And really honoured to be here. Yes, as Ronnie said, I've recently published a biography of Terence McKenna, which is well regarded as the best biography, but it's also the only biography of Terence. And so I'm going to indulge you a little bit with what I'm calling the Terence scene, Dosser scene. And I'm sure I'll get that right before I come around and before this mic actually works. It's going to be the 12 sides of Terence, which is a very abstract way of approaching Terence McKenna, who many people may or may not know as one of the most enigmatic figures in the history of psychedelic culture and the underground, a guy who's self-identified as an anarcho-mystic and regarded himself as an edge runner, to use that late 80s cyberpunk term, and very much a mercurial figure who was enigmatic. So he was, on the one hand, he was and remains known as a heroic phenomenon in the psychedelic underground, but is also something of a persona non grata in the world of psychedelic science, a preposterous figure, a charming yet impossible figure. And it's this tension that has fascinated me, really driven this biography. So we're talking about a guy who died at the age of 53 from brain cancer, and yet remains one of the most loved, yet still little known figures in psychedelic culture. And so the word I was trying to get at there was the terihedron. It's a word that I've conjured myself and I could never remember it. The terihedron. So we're going to get through these 12 sides of Terence, and I'll try to get through them with some haste. This liminal cornucopia is a source of effrontery and endearment, and this complex liminality really helps explain why Terence has been such a difficult figure for any biographer and historian to approach. Oh, here we go. Yeah. So these identifications, and I'll get through them, are traits that combine to shape an occult sensibility. And the occult, should be noted, refers to phenomena saturated with ambivalence, thought and practice at once repudiated and exalted, rejected and esteemed, hidden and revealing. And so I'll be drawing on content that draws from my biography, which chronicles Terence's life and work. And this has been a project that's been 10 years in the making. There's over 80 interviews with friends and family, lovers, colleagues, extensive research of public and private archival research, hundreds of hours of spoken word recordings I've accessed, and still I couldn't claim to have listened to or been exposed to every Terence recording, with at least 500 hours. I don't think anyone could claim that. I will project some material from the oldest known recording in this presentation. So we'll start with Freak. McKenna was closely involved with the Esalen Institute at Big Sur, California, going right back to the early 70s, and had month-long residencies there for over more than a decade through the 80s and 90s. in his book Esalen, America and the Religion of No Religion. Jeffrey Kripal briefly acknowledges McKenna's contribution to Esalen, conceding that it is difficult to know what to do with McKenna today. The challenge posed for intellectuals echoes McKenna's status as an intellectual anomaly, an unclassifiable enigma, a gnomic phenomena, literally a freak. As Eric Davis clarifies in his High Weirdness, freak embodies the logic of the weird, and Terence McKenna was and remains the shooting star of that calculus. The highest point of weirdness, the moment in freak lore, as reported by Davis, was the McKenna brothers' experiment at La Chorrera in the Colombian Amazon in 1971. As related in Terence's memoir, True Hallucinations, the experiment at La Chorrera, a quest involving a bounteous supply of mushrooms, the ayahuasca vine, and the vivid imagination of young psychonauts, was an apex of freak folk history. For the origins of this quest, we must turn back to the mid-60s, when Terence had a profound exposure to the source of his life's calling. It is not insignificant that in February 1966, having escaped Paonia, his hometown in Colorado, Terence had a psychedelic eureka moment soon after arriving at UC Berkeley. The San Francisco Bay Area of the mid-60s, and specifically Berkeley, was the explosive epicenter in place and time of the freak universe. In the fall of '65, Terry, at least a large rooming house on Telegraph Avenue on the corner of Russell Street. He sublet rooms to fellow students over the course of the next 2 years. His room was right there in that in the corner of the building. That structure in front wasn't there by the time he moved in. Not yet. It was a cold, so I'm going to read you a short snippet from the book. It was a cold, damp evening on Telegraph Avenue in February '66 when an odd young man in a little black suit buttoned up the throat mounted the steps and rapped on the door of 2894. A tall, wiry freak bade him entry. Held by his host as his great inspiration, the guest is recalled as being always the one to get there first, whatever it was, to do it, to reject it, and to be absolutely contemptuous of it by the time anybody else even arrived at the scene of the crime. On this occasion, the guest had arrived with a little glass pipe and stuff that looked like orange mothballs. "Something that might interest you," said Rick Watson. "What is it?" "It's called dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. "How long does it last?" 10 minutes. To which Terence McKenna replied, "Let the good times roll." And now I'm going to play audio.
And I sank to the floor. I couldn't move, and this diastolic hallucination of tumbling forward into these fractal geometric spaces made of light. And then I found myself in the sort of auric equivalent of the Pope's private chapel, and there were insect elf machines proffering strange little tablets with strange writing on them, and I was aghast, completely appalled, because if the transition had been a matter of seconds, and my entire expectation of the nature of the world was just being shredded in front of me. I've never actually gotten over it. It all went on. I mean, they were speaking in some kind of, there were these self-transforming machine elf creatures were speaking in some kind of colored language, which condensed into these rotating machines that were like Fabergé eggs but crafted out of luminescent superconducting ceramics and liquid crystal gels, and all this stuff was just so weird and so alien and so un-Englishable.
Exposed to the effects of DMT at this seminal juncture, struck by translinguistic lightning, McKenna embarked on his life quest. For the McKenna brothers, the ubiquity of DMT throughout nature, its presence in the brain, and the role of tryptamines in consciousness presented a mystery that demanded their attention. Long celebrating the mystery of the molecule, Terence became responsible for its emergence as a source of fascination. My last book, which is 10 years old now, copies of which are on the table, as well as Strange Attractor, which are units I'll be attempting to move later, was my last book, and that chronicles the cultural history of DMT. From his early Berkeley phase, Terence was driven by an independent course of study that compelled him to grok the meaning of DMT. His life became a trans-dimensional quest. Terence later adopted a maxim attributed to Publius Terentius Afer, aka Terence, a Roman African playwright who lived during the Roman Republic and thus his Roman namesake. I am a human being, and therefore nothing human is alien to me. As our Terence clarified, my method, my style has always been to be open-minded, to be critical, to be rational, but to seek the weird and to seek it seriously. With a natural vocal ability to summon and synthesize fragments from diverse subjects, our Terence had been widely considered a genius autodidact, a capacity for retrieving information, complex taxonomies, molecular structures, succinct articulations of verse and theory, became a legendary feature of his public persona. And speaking of freak collectors of the anomalous, McKenna's life quest was a serious commitment to live without closure, which puts him in a similar league to author of the Book of the Damned, Charles Fort. The renowned collector of data of the damned railed against positivists and exclusionists who always seek to explain away and close off weird events and anomalous occurrences through rationalist explanations. As a psychedelic anomalist, McKenna displayed a strong Fortean streak. The sensibility of the exile, as I move on to a second thing, loomed large in McKenna's imagination. He was an iconoclast who escaped from his hometown of Paonia in Colorado, who became a cultural refugee from Nixon's America, who sought refuge in India, Nepal, the Amazon, and later in cyberspace. From an early age, science fiction became a means of escape. This was not just a personal refuge in books, but a propulsion into the cosmic worlds of space operas, Asimov, Dick, Bradbury, Zelazny, Pohl. Through the minds of sci-fi greats, McKenna was exposed to the narrative vision of humans evolving, special abilities of humans getting high as a species, leaving the planet and joining a galactic fraternity. Sci-fi amounted to his first drug, paving the way for the psychedelics that furnished the desired departure from the conditions of self and society. The active self-othering from the US of the late 60s, the metabolic mechanisms that bootstrapped an exilic persona. By 1969, he dwelt in Budanath in Nepal, where he lived as a, to use his word, metapolitical exile, a self-description from an unpublished manuscript that he eventually titled Post-Electric Thought. As a young traveller, and now we're moving on to his Gnostic persona, upon returning to the US and through the pursuit of what he came to call the time wave, McKenna adopted a Gnostic or neo-Gnostic guise. This post-materialist and liberatory approach was evident in The Invisible Landscape, the book that he co-authored with his brother, where humans are not only cast to break free from the iron cage of rationalism, but are destined to be liberated from matter, from the body, and even from death itself. McKenna's Gnostic proclivity is essentially a metamorphic mania that pursues the redemption of spirit from the dark chrysalis of matter. McKenna later surmised that through his introduction to acid, and even more so his exposure to DMT in February '66, he had undergone a psychedelic gnosis. It was a conversion experience from an angst-ridden existentialist adolescence. And what became identified as psychedelic shamanism is routinely couched as a neo-Gnostic myth of redemption, with strong echoes of Hans Donus's The Gnostic Religion. At other times, McKenna regards the approach as a radical Neoplatonist intuition, explained as follows, and we have the next sample.
The radical Neoplatonist intuition was that man had an immortal, an incorruptible light trapped within him, and that the release, and that this light came from outside this universe, that the creator of this universe was a demon, that we were inside an iron prison, this is a phrase they used, and but that we were truly of the nature of this alien light that was outside of space and time, and that the soteriological enterprise, the salvational enterprise, was to release this light back into its higher and hidden source and get it away from the corrupting influence of the world.
Mandaism was an enduring narrative framework, Mandaism, referring to the Mesopotamian baptismal movement, thought to be the oldest continuous Western religion with a Gnostic intent. As McKenna once stated, I sort of think that we all should become Mandaeans. Out of all the religions he studied, the Mandaeans were the most psychedelic, the most ethically correct. The Amazonian adventure and its experiment was driven by a psychedelic Gnostic approach. Upon Terence's instruction, expedition members were attired in loose white clothing. He wore the outfit throughout his East Asian and South American adventures. People will accept you with the Mandaean fixation. The Gnostic approach merges with the uniquely alienist phenomenology, the freedom from alienation, and from the alienated self is implicit to an off-planetary agenda amounting to an embrace of the alien other. The recognition that you are the alien appears to be the ultimate revelation, gnosis in the McKenna opus. And move on to the next theme, which, as Terence says, heretic. So he was a recovering Catholic. He'd been an altar boy at Paonia's Sacred Heart Catholic Church, where he had first taken communion and possibly also confirmation. And this leads to our next sample.
Well, by the time I was 9 or 10, I was a earnest practitioner of ceremonial magic. And I would draw pentacles in my room and burn rosemary, and I was also an altar boy at this time. And it made some problems. I recall one time, I don't know how many of you are recovering Catholics, but there's a thing which they bring out once a year. I don't know if they still do this. They've sort of left the faith, but they have this thing which they use at Midnight Mass and Easter called an aspergillium, and it looks like a baby's rabble. And you put it in water, and it has holes in the round head, and it fills with holy water, and then you can fling holy water great distances with this thing. And so one day back in the sacristy, we were cleaning out some things, and the priest came upon this old aspergillium. And I said, whoa, he was about to get rid of it. I said, well, I have a use for that. And he said, oh, what is your use for this, my son? And I said, well, I'm involved in the conjuration of Azael, the 11th general of the Mercuric sphere. It's launched an investigation that has made that town unsafe for the practice of ceremonial magic to this day.
This is a good example of the kind of information. It's very difficult to process as a biographer. That point where the hallucination ends and the truth begins. While repudiating Catholicism, McKenna never made a complete break with his Catholic roots. He maintained an obsession with Christian eschatology, with end times. His understanding of the eschaton, and notably with his unique take on salvation, permeates what he came to know as the time wave. Recognizing this depth, he regarded his own take on the eschaton as Catholicism with the chrome stripped off. The ideas of French geologist, paleontologist, and Jesuit priest Pierre Teilhard de Chardin were formative. In The Phenomenon of Man, Teilhard argued that humans are evolving towards an omega point, a kind of Christ consciousness, culminating in an angelic being. McKenna's adoption of the omega point converted this Christogenesis into a psychedelics-inspired apocalypse, his eschaton. Implicit here is a transhumanist redemption reliant on a new future, in a near-future transformation of the human condition, a transformation that was psychedelic, messianic, and miraculous, and thoroughly informed by science fiction influences. Elsewhere, as a further example of his twisted appropriation of Christian myth, Adam and Eve's expulsion from the Garden of Eden and subsequent fall is regarded as history's first drug bust. McKenna's obsession with Abrahamic apocalypse, and notably the eschaton, gave his friend Rupert Sheldrake cause to teasingly regard him as Father Terence. There he is. This photo's been mocked up, but apparently he did have a T-shirt that did state eschaton. So we move on to the next thing, which is Terence's outlaw. As an advocate of scheduled compounds, criminalized mind states, and taboo metabolism, McKenna was an outlaw. He was for some time in his prime a fugitive, following a hash smuggling bust in Colorado in August '69, and took evasive strategies while trekking India and Asia over the next few years. He was eventually given 2 years unsupervised probation. You have an image there as a court document from the District of Colorado, July 1972. While outside the law, the plants and molecules pervade were integral to the lore, L-O-R-E, of the psychedelic underground. An early business card, mid-70s business name Omega Associates, evokes a cornucopia of imports from antiques to butterflies and flora. And there's another business card there just with the words special projects, which is possibly one of the most innocuous yet intriguing business cards in the history of business cards. Identifying as a consultant in 1976, he published with Dennis their pseudonymous guide for cultivating psilocybin cubensis. And this was published in '76 with subsequent editions. over the next decade, 2 decades. And with his wife, Kat Harrison, he started a business, Lux Natura, and later Syzygy, selling mail-order spore kits. We move on to our next theme, which is Terence's anarchist. McKenna was distrustful of all authority, whether religious, scientific, political, familial, cultural. I think he may have been misquoting Groucho Marx by stating that he never trusted an organisation that would accept him as a member. This libertarian streak put him at odds with academic professionals, officers of knowledge, gatekeepers of science, promoters of positivism, and defenders of ruling paradigms. After completing his Bachelor of Science in '75, he pursued a career fiercely independent from academia. Ultimately, McKenna's independent stance is personified in his role as a cognitive libertarian. Throughout the dark years of the war on drugs, he advocated a liberal approach to drug education. And this clearly was a position that he could not adopt within academia. And to our next theme is Terence's bard. His chief art form was his voice. He had a marvelous command of language, a remarkable capacity to retrieve and synthesize information. He was a freak oracle responsible for a vast archive of spoken word recordings, over 500 hours of content. So these raps continue to be uncovered, such as recently the rap that's associated with this video that I'm about to play. I'll play you the first minute or so of this video, which is called Amazon Psychotropic Quest, and it was recorded in an apartment in San Francisco in 1972. I'll just show you a few of just a few of the examples of the many raps. And so I'll screen this video. I think it's the only video I have, and it has some audio. Doesn't need to be exactly accurate, this audio.
On the count of 3.
Okay. 1, 2, 3. So this video was put together by Peter Bergman, and it was recorded by Thomas Starr, who had met Terence on the day of this recording.
Came as a translator, and she and I were living together as much as you can live together. We used to live in hammocks with 6 other people and climb off a boat every night and tie them in the trees. But anyway, we were living together. But he was listening. And he came. It's hard to explain. There's a phenomenon happening in South America, which thank God you don't meet in India. And it has to do with nut religions. People, the New Jerusalem, people who are generally fruitarian. And, well, there's no way to put it except absolutely nuts. It's like a tribe of people who since 1962 or 3 have been drifting down through Mexico, chiseling on each other, living with each other, hating each other, pinky trees. Right. And at one time it was called what? The Rainbow Family. Anyway, they communicated with these things called the beings of light, and they communicated with them through Ouija boards. And this whole
mythology was built up around, I don't know, it's just very depressing to go into. But anyway.
But Mars Sector 6?
I don't know, I don't think so. Everyone is a reincarnation. For instance, there's one guy who thinks he's the reincarnation of Rasputin, and named Robin. Another guy, this guy who was a refugee from the Hare Krishna, wears white robes and white upper boots.
This goes on for a while.
The reincarnation of Erwin Rommel.
But I have another recording that's on the next slide that will play all of it. So I'll just introduce this next one. So this recordings are interesting because it's the oldest known recording of Terence, and it was recorded about 18 months after the experiment at La Chorrera in Colombia. So if you're familiar with Terence's memoir, True Hallucinations, you'll see that the core narrative to that story is already evident here, and he's relating that to a small audience of friends in an apartment in San Francisco in 1972, which is at least 10 years before he became Terence McKenna. And I want to, so he was effectively beta testing the story later included in True Hallucinations. And there's a point in this where Terence indicates the moment when Dennis convinces him to undertake their experiment. And so we'll play that. 1, 2, 3.
And so he said, we must set up an experiment. We must attempt to do this. We have everything here necessary to do it. We have Yahe, which is our source of harmony. We have Stropharia cubanensis, which is our source of tryptamine. We can metabolize the tryptamine. We have it metabolizing in another form of life, i.e. the mushroom. There's no one around. We can do it. And he just retired into a world of very intense activity, and he wrote it over and over again, the steps, the theory, why it should work. And we moved into the forest. This was the thing. These Indians were living in a house that we were due to take, and they finally got their shit together and moved on. And so we had been told that when they left we could move to this hut. And Dennis would just spend lots of time alone, writing furiously, or he would come back and talk to us. And by he was on to something very strange. I mean, his word pictures caused reality to shimmer and crinkle at the edges. I mean, he was really in touch with this bubbling obsidian 4D fluid that we were going to thaw into a usable tool and end history and go to the stars and explode the sun and end it all. And so we said, fine, so we'll try it. And, the atmosphere was just drenched with tryptamine. I mean, now we had come to the center of the Amazon, and you could feel it in the sky watching you. And you said, oh, God, we thought it was nothing, just happy heads trying to explode one last fairy tale so we could be rationalists forever. And now we've come out here and, it's enormous, and it's alive, and it's, very old.
So, still on the theme of Terence's Bard, in the early 90s, Goa trance and its broad progeny became a chief vehicle of the Bard's voice, as here demonstrated by Eat Static. Thank you, sister. It was a very short sample. I only have short samples here. I could do a whole talk on samples, audio samples from the history of psychedelic electronic. I only have a few. So jumping forward more than 25 years, by which time McKenna had become the most sampled individual in the history of electronic music. Here's Greek forest trance artist Biophotons transmitting the Bard. Thank you, sister.
through an interaction, a symbiosis, a relationship to local plants that perturb brain chemistry. And in this domain of perturbed brain chemistry, the cultural operating system is wiped clean. Through an interaction,
We've heard that. No, we haven't heard this one. Here's another sample from Psytrance artist Zik. It's another very short sample. Give you some exposure to what I'm talking about. Thank you, sister.
This is who you are. This is true nakedness. You are not naked when you take off your clothes. You still wear your religious assumptions, your prejudices, your fears, your illusions, your delusions. When you shed the cultural operating system, then essentially you stand naked before the inspection of your own soul.
So the McKenna archive that's been built from over 500 hours of unique raps is a unique repository of content that's been raided by and sutured together in the creation of meta McKennas, LLMs that have designed based on Terence's voice, cyber oracles, cybernetic reanimation that has enabled Terence to become this spectral phenomenon. Is essentially, in my view, a net era exemplar of a figure who is in a constant state of departure whilst always arriving. So this leads me to the theme of the shaman, an attitude adopted in the Amazon and afterwards ranged close to this figure held in high esteem and often aligned with a poet. In The Invisible Landscape, a book that was initially titled Shamanic Investigations, the shaman is said to act as an intermediary between society and the collective unconscious. This forecasts the guise that Terence assumed, a neo-shamanic psychedelic psychopomp experienced in traversing and dissolving the boundaries between consciousness and unconsciousness, between reality and the unreal, between truth and fiction, life and death, returning to issue the news from hyperspace. Terence initiated countless people into the tryptamine mysteries. Neo-shamanism is implicit to the revitalization movement he named the Archaic Revival. But an evaluation of the psychedelic shaman would be amiss without recognition of the alchemist. Himself steeped in esoteric practices of the West and East, McKenna was a true alchemist. There was abiding interest in Hermeticism. The Corpus Hermeticum afforded an inspired philosophical model. There's no evidence that McKenna made any detailed study of these texts, but folks at Esalen and elsewhere were exposed to the primary texts of a religion of the redemption of the earth through magic. He gave several raps and workshops on the east and west coast in the US in the 90s that focused on this hermetic content, inspired by the work of historian Francis Yates, Magus Intelligencer and court astrologer to Elizabeth I, John Dee was celebrated as a true Renaissance man. And prized in McKenna's library was the original work edited by Merrick Kosovan, a true and faithful relation of what passed for many years between John Dee and some spirits, etc., etc. Probably the longest title one of the longest titles. And I know that this book exists. I held it in my hands just last night. That D, a figure who interpreted the scribed voices of angels, was among McKenna's heroes, is apparent in a documentary, The Alchemical Dream, in which he affected the persona and raiment of D. He collected Hermetic texts, notably several English editions of Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy or magic, dating back to the mid-17th century. There's an image of his library in the second house built in Hawaii in the mid-90s. Inspired by the work of Jung, McKenna was thoroughly informed by the Hermetic concept of the coincidentia oppositorum, the union of opposites, a theme that permeated his life. The paradoxical process endemic to alchemy served as a guiding principle. Contradiction was not a flaw in McKenna's thinking, but a code to live by. Paradox was a feature, not a bug. So this leads me to his role as something of a maverick scientist. Terence embraced an experimental science when it suited him, though he was largely dissonant with the scientific method. He was a champion of intuition, and he was averse to physicalism and other forms of positivism. He was fond of impugning scientists, including social scientists, such as those masquerading as sociologists and anthropologists. And this leads me to the next sample.
What really thrills a scientist is when you have a theory that makes a prediction down to 5 or 6 decimal points, and then you perform an experiment, and it's spot on down to 5 or 6 decimal points, and then everybody involved in what's going on has extremely high confidence that they're on the right track. Well, now only one science is ever that good: physics, macrophysics. Chemistry, it's good, but it's not that good. Ecology, biology, demography, these are pretty loose. They play with numbers, but it's a fig leaf. And by the time you get to sociology or something like that, I mean, these clowns have just snuck under the tent and should actually be shown the door and put back outside with the card readers.
An early hero, just continuing on the scientific theme, was naturalist Alfred Wallace, an outsider scientist, an underdog in the emergence of evolutionary theory. A.N. Whitehead, mathematician, process and novelty theorist, was another hero. Of course, his own brother, Dennis, ethnopharmacologist, of renown himself, was a great source of inspiration. Another inspiration was biochemist and close friend and collaborator Rupert Sheldrake, whose theory of morphogenic resonance was used to reinforce and legitimate Terence's own ideas. Sheldrake was a member of the intellectual threesomes called Trialogues, went on for at least a decade. The main attempt to obtain credibility in the world of science was the so-called stoned ape theory, and which is this theory of psilocybin mushrooms being essentially the missing link in the development of consciousness. And the chief output was his book Food of the Gods. So I move on to, I think it might be my second last personification, and that is his claims about time, notably the end of time. And he predicted the end of history to be December the 21st, 2012, approximate the visions of a prophet. As his friend Peter Mayer suggested, he was a genuine prophet speaking to us by means of something like divine illumination. And there's a relevant passage here or two with some fairly unreserved comments from a workshop at Esalen in July '94. And this is representative of his persistent claims, of his persistent claims. And he claimed these were supported by a mathematical model. And so we can play the first one. Thanks, Sister.
I'm saying that at the winter solstice of 2012 AD, at 18 minutes after 11 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, the state of physics in this part of the universe will undergo a dynamical collapse of some sort. Not the environment, not human society. The laws of physics will undergo a collapse. And the rest of the history of the universe will happen in about 20 minutes. It is as if you can imagine that we might be on a collision course with an asteroid. You might be able to imagine that we're on a collision course with a black hole. But what I'm suggesting is that we're on a collision course with something that we cannot model or imagine at this point. And it's possible to call it, Christ triumphant, if that's what you want to call it. Or it's possible to call it the end of the world. Or it's possible to call it the dawn of hyperspace. Call it what you like. It isn't simply the collapse of civilization. It isn't simply the end of life as we know it. It's the end of everything as we know.
And I think there's a second sample there which actually follows on from that.
I'm willing to be so crazy and reckless and to let my own reputation hang so far out there that I'm willing to take a stand and say, based on my calculation, based on my measurement of the rate of collapse, we're not talking about 500 years or 100 years or 50 years. We're talking about well under 7,000 days at this point. And I can feel all this stuff about the net, all these epidemic diseases, all this political upheaval and collapse, all this uncertainty on the part of the managers of the planet. It indicates that this is the final act. We're going to find out who killed Miss Plum this act. I'm saying that at the winter.
So the time wave was the result of Terence's efforts to decode the I Ching as an ancient calendar. It was hardly a rap that he gave where he didn't reach his kind of crescendo, especially in his later years. It was a persistent rap. At one time earlier, he travelled with an 8.5-foot long chart on graph paper that he kept rolled up in a bamboo tube, and he would unroll this and unfurl it before folks in bus stops and dime stations. The time wave and its implicit theory of novelty was the culmination of many elements of his thinking and practice. To me, it represents less an algorithm and more a mythopoetic phenomenon. Implicit to his obsession with the greatest novelty of all was something called the transcendental object at the end of time. This object stands at the center, and indeed the end of his freak cosmology. It is the ultimate union of opposites, the ultimate enigma. To convey his understanding of what this was, perhaps his most useful metaphor was the mirror ball, and I think this might be my last sample. Thanks, Sister.
It is like those bar balls that they hang in discos that send out thousands of reflections off everybody and everything in the room. Well, think of the transcendental object at the end of time as that bar ball, and then those reflective, twinkling, refractive lights are religions, scientific theories, gurus, works of art, poetry, great orgasms, great souffles, great paintings. In other words, anything which has, we even use this phrase, anything which has a spark of divinity in it is in fact reference to the original source of the sparks of all divinity, which is the compressed experience of life and mind after billions of years of unfolding itself within the confines of three-dimensional space.
Now, moving to the last personification. McKenna wasn't just an eschatologist, he was the stand-up eschatologist. He was a provocateur, a psychedelic surrealist, a uniquely esoteric psychonaut comic, whose life quest was a surrealist, occult odyssey. As such, he occupies a very strange place in the history of esotericism in the West. Noteworthy, his approach to the other and to othering the self was a psychedelic and particularly tryptaminal means of altering metabolism and consciousness. He did not suffer lightly those with what he called squirrely notions, by which he typically meant the unstoned, spiritualists, New Agers, ufologists believing in garden variety aliens, were all castigated in his stand-up routines. A wicked sense of humor was frequently met with gales of laughter. As a provocateur, he was fascinated with collagists like Max Ernst. He recognized the historical significance of Breton's Surrealist Manifesto. And he took an interest in absurdist art movements that reject a metaphysical world beyond our own, frequently invoking abstract expressionism, surrealism, and pataphysics, among other avant-garde developments. And French symbolist and patriarch of Dada, Alfred Jarry, was held in esteem and even became something of a mascot for his archaic revival. So, to conclude, and to attempt to round all that up, having introduced you to the terihedron, a dodecahedron of archetypes, a map of trans-personality, where we've explored 12 characteristics of Terence McKenna, traits that are anomalous, exilic, redemptive, iconoclastic, illicit, libertarian, immediate, visionary, paradoxical, maverick, apocalyptic, and provocative. These personifications do not exhaust our enigmatic subject, still among the most loved and yet little understood figures in psychedelic folklore. These dimensions of the possible have compressed in a rare antinomian figure, a psychedelic trickster, all at once alien and touchstone. And thank you for bearing with me. As I mentioned, if anyone would be interested in purchasing a signed copy and paying the low price of $60, not $65, then you can walk away with the unit. Thank you.
It's over here. I believe he's going to sign anyone who grabs a copy today. So, fantastic read. I also want to point out
I also have copies of Mystery School and Hyperspace, also my last book that was published 10 years ago.
And there's a fantastic article about Terence McKenna in the EGA Journal, which is very much based on his trip and experiences in Australia. So if you're interested in his trip in Australia, come and check this one out. It's available online and it's a fantastic journal. All right, I think we're going to take some questions, but I'll start with an anecdote. I'm a little bit of a fan, and he came to my house about 2 years ago, and I said, "Oh, come on, Graham, can you sign a book?" And Graham said, "Yeah, that's okay." And he got there, and I put about 9 books in front of him, and he looked down and went, "Oh, okay, let's do it." So it was a very fun moment. We had a great day. Okay, anyone got a question for Graham about this book or any of his other work or McKenna in general? I think you've answered all those questions. That's not true.
I'm going to have to play you all some Terence samples, or perhaps even Sister will play them all. I'm sure maybe because you're up next, aren't you? Maybe you're going to incorporate some McKenna samples into your 60s and 70s disco. I don't know.
All right. Well, I've got a question. What's next? You've got a book that's basically sold out, first edition, and you must be thinking, what's next? Can I do more McKenna, or what are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I just think there's more to be said about Terence, and so yeah, I'm regarding this as volume 1, and who knows when volume 2 will come out, but I think we need to go deeper into, because whereas this is more biographical, I think we need to go deeper into his iconoclastic metaphysics and essentially his weirdness. And even though I sort of characterize myself as a cross between a sort of Inspector Clouseau and Captain Willard, I'm ultimately not an assassin, and I've been helped a lot by dozens of people who provided me with stories and have shared stories, many of which haven't gone into the book. So I think there's more room for stories from people such as his ex-wife, Kat Harrison, who I had long conversations with, and other family members, and other of his friends like Rick Watson, who was really instrumental to the project, and other folks who are sort of coming out of the woodwork, because once a book like this sort of rolls, people tend to come out of the woodwork and want to get involved. And we're also encouraged by the fact that his daughter, Clea McKenna, has recently started an archive which is essentially excavating all these materials that have been in storage for 25 years, including journals and lots of materials that I hadn't known about. So for someone who's just released a biography of Terence, this is like an incredible gold mine. So I mean, I always knew that this project wasn't complete, and nor could a single project, no matter how many books it involves, could be complete. But the fact that there's all this raw materials soon to be available, because I'm sure the family will put together this archive and make it and make it available through a repository, which will be really, really exciting.
Got a question here.
Hi, Graham. I might have asked you this before, and I just probably forgot. I'm a huge fan of Terence McKenna's recordings, so I love his voice. I love listening to his nasal, just kind of ramblings, and just the things that he comes up with. I'm also a huge fan of James Joyce, particularly Finnegan's Wake. That kind of bizarre glossolalia that Joyce kind of has going throughout that entire book. And trying to read it, it just never makes sense. Are you aware of any recordings that McKenna might have made actually reading Finnegan's Wake? Because that would just be something just gorgeous to listen to. The McKenna tone and his own kind of weird musicology in his voice, and then with of course fitting in how James Joyce's.
There are recordings. I mean, he gave. I mean, it's so unfortunate, obviously, that he left us so soon, because I'm sure that had he lived the last 25 years, he was already assuming the role of a Joycean scholar in some respects. I mean, he did give a presentation, one very well-known talk, which was focused exclusively on Joyce, and it was quite well known. And in that rap, he reads, I think, from both Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, and also raps some passages that by heart. Now, I'm not sure that he was able to do that to absolute accuracy, but I suppose it was close enough. I'm not a Joycean scholar. But he regarded Joyce's work, notably Finnegan's Wake, as the most psychedelic text that he became exposed to, and he carried copies of these around when he had studied these texts according to his own methods, and inspired by DMT and mushrooms throughout his early 20s. And like I say, had he lived, I mean, he was a guy who was, sporting himself as something of a Joycean scholar without even, making those claims. And I suppose that he could be thrown into a conference. Not that he would ever want to do that, because I think once he went to an academic-style conference which was a conference on shamanism full of anthropologists in 1982, he never returned. He essentially, showed up at his own events and created his own events. But had he, appeared at a Joycean scholar, I'm sure he would have blown people away, despite the fact that he had no notes, and he could and wasn't representing any institution or anybody, and much of it was off the cuff, which is the most extraordinary thing about this guy, who could just retrieve so much information. It was so much like watching, and it is so much like watching a computer, and which I suppose is one of the reasons why he has been so widely embraced in the post-internet era. But thank you, Kane, for that question, which I'm not sure I answered.
All right. Anyone else have a question for Graham? Okay, I just want to get one question briefly, because I know the answer to this. But how long did you work on this book, just to give people an idea? Because it's, there's authors and there's authors, but you have spent some time on this, and if you can let us know how you got attracted to this, to doing the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an overnight thing. We worked on this for about 10 years, and it's not a project that's complete by any stretch. And I suppose someone I never met Terence, but given that his voice seemed to filter into my sensorium in various states of discombobulation on dance floors in this country and elsewhere. I suppose that was the origin of the influence. I mean, who is this guy? What the fuck is this guy talking about? And but it's not unlike the permeation of his voice among many. But I suppose that if you're I mean, what fascinates me about this permeation of Terence's voice in psychedelic electronica, and he is one of the most sampled person in the history of electronic music. I don't think there's any parallels to that. Is that I think that if an alien anthropologist were to arrive on these dance floors at the moment of Terence's voice being broadcast, they would, I didn't think that they could be, confused for mistaking his voice for the voice of of an authority. So that's always fascinated me. And but thanks for the question.
No worries. If you could put your hands together